Homemaking Through the Decades Audiobook Edition. The 1930s Ingenuity in Hard Times. The 1930s arrived in American homes like a door slamming shut. The stock market crash of October 1929 sent shockwaves through an economy that had been built in significant part on debt and speculation. And by 1930, those shockwaves had reached the kitchen table. The homemaker, who had spent the previous decade enjoying electric appliances, packaged foods, and the pleasant new idea that leisure was her right, found herself facing a completely different set of demands. Survival was not dramatic. It was daily, grinding, and intensely practical. Unemployment reached 25% at the Depression's peak. Bank failures wiped out savings, factories closed. Farms that had been mortgaged to buy new equipment went into foreclosure. The installment plan appliances that had seemed like progress, the Frigidaire, the Hoover, the electric mixer, were repossessed when the payments stopped. The homemaker, who had learned to rely on these tools, found herself back at older methods, often with fewer resources than her mother had possessed. And yet she managed. This is the central fact of the 1930s homemaker's story. Against conditions that broke stronger systems than a household budget, she found ways to feed her children, clothe them from flour sacks, stretch a pot of beans across 3 meals, and maintain enough of a domestic normal that her family did not come apart. The resourcefulness required was not occasional or inspired. It was sustained, systematic, and absolutely serious. The Dust Bowl compounded the economic crisis in the Great Plains from 1930 through 1936. Drought and topsoil erosion turned millions of acres of farmland into wasteland, forcing the displacement of 3.5 million people from Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and neighboring states. The homemakers who made the journey west, the Okies of John Steinbeck's documentation, carried their domestic knowledge with them into the labor camps and improvised settlements of California. Their ability to make something of nothing in conditions of desperate poverty and dislocation was the survival skill that kept families intact. Against this backdrop, the federal government's New Deal programs tried to restore stability. Home economics agents traveled to rural communities, teaching stretching techniques, nutritional cooking with limited ingredients, and canning methods that could preserve the summer garden through a lean winter. The homemaker who attended these demonstrations was not being taught to be poor gracefully. She was being armed with knowledge that could make the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine deprivation for her children. Practical homemaking guides. The 1930s homemaker's kitchen was a masterclass in constraint-based creativity. She had some of the skills from the previous decade: appliances when they hadn't been repossessed, knowledge of nutrition and food science, the domestic magazine culture that had been educating her throughout the 1920s. What she did not have was money, reliable ingredients, or any margin for waste. Every decision in the kitchen was a calculation. The core strategies of the Depression kitchen were clear and practical. Dried beans served as the decade's most economical protein source: versatile, nutritious, filling, and cheap. Cornmeal and flour were stretched with water, baking powder, and creativity. Flour sack fabric, feed and flour sacks were now printed in attractive patterns specifically because women were sewing them into clothing, became the source of children's dresses and household linens. The root cellar was revived as critical, not optional. Lard replaced butter as the fat of choice, rendered from whatever pork was affordable. Mock foods, mock apple pie, mock whipped cream, mock everything, demonstrated that constraint could produce surprising creativity. Soups and stews made one pot deliver maximum nutrition from minimum ingredients, and homemade bread every day was far cheaper than store-bought and far better. The flour sack dress became an unexpected symbol of the Depression homemaker's ingenuity. Flour and feed companies, aware that their sacks were being sewn into clothing, began printing them in attractive patterns and colors specifically to make the fabric more desirable. A woman shopping for flour was also shopping for fabric. The cheerful printed flour sack dress, worn by a child who had no idea it was made from packaging, was a small masterpiece of Depression-era resourcefulness. Stretching meat was an art. A chicken that had given its productive years as a laying hen was now tough, but it was free, or nearly so. Slow cooking transformed it. A soup bone from the butcher cost almost nothing and gave flavor and nutrition to a pot of vegetables. Organ meats, liver, kidneys, heart, were cheap and nutritious and appeared on Depression-era tables with a regularity that post-war prosperity would make unusual. The homemaker, who knew how to cook liver well, was providing excellent nutrition at minimal cost. The 1930s pantry was built from what she could store for the long term. Dried beans in every variety: navy, pinto, kidney, black-eyed peas; cornmeal for cornbread, mush, and stretching other dishes; flour bought in printed fabric sacks when possible; lard and drippings rendered and saved from every cooking; salt pork or fatback for flavoring beans and greens; home canned tomatoes from the summer garden; potatoes stored in the root cellar through winter; dried apples for pies when fresh fruit was scarce. This was not poverty. This was strategy. Lifestyle and well-being. The 1930s homemaker's well-being was tested in ways that had no modern precedent within living memory. The psychological weight of sustained scarcity, of not knowing where next week's groceries were coming from, of watching a husband's confidence erode with his employment prospects, of maintaining cheerfulness for children who sensed what they were not being told, was enormous. And it was carried largely quietly. The decade's domestic advice literature addressed this directly. Women's magazines carried articles on maintaining morale in hard times, on the importance of keeping meals attractive even when they were plain, on the psychological value of small pleasures: a flower on the table, a clean house, the radio playing something cheerful in the evening. These were not frivolities. They were strategies for emotional survival. She kept the table set with care even when the meal was plain. This was not pretense. It was dignity, maintained deliberately. The difference between a meal served on the good china versus eaten standing at the counter was not in the food. It was in what the homemaker was telling her family about themselves and their worth. The radio became more important than ever in the 1930s. It was free entertainment. Once you had the set, the content cost nothing. The homemaker, who had listened to cooking demonstrations and music in the prosperous 1920s, now listened to soap operas, comedy programs, and Franklin Roosevelt's fireside chats, which told her, in a reassuring voice, that the nation's difficulties were understood and being addressed. Whether or not she believed it, the voice in the parlor was company. The community networks that had begun to loosen in the prosperous 1920s tightened again out of necessity. Neighbors helped neighbors in ways that had been less urgent before. A woman who had a productive garden shared produce with a neighbor who had none. Church networks provided informal food assistance. Women's clubs organized community canning programs so that families without gardens could preserve food bought cheaply in season. The Depression returned community to its older function, not pleasure, but survival. Skills development. The Depression forced a dramatic reevaluation of which skills mattered. The consumer skills of the 1920s, evaluating advertising, choosing between brands, understanding appliance features, became largely irrelevant when there was no money to spend. The older skills surged back in importance: preserving, mending, making do, improvising with whatever was at hand. The homemaker, who had maintained her grandmother's skills alongside the decade's new ones, was far better positioned than one who had abandoned the old ways entirely. The skills the Depression made essential were formidable. Home canning and preserving became more critical than at any point since World War I. Mending and remaking meant clothing was repaired, remade, and repurposed. Nothing was discarded while it retained any usefulness. Flour sack sewing transformed packaging into usable fabric. Stretching recipes meant making one meal serve as two or three. Substitution cooking required knowing what could replace what. Root cellar management meant storing vegetables through winter without loss to freezing or rot. Soap making returned when commercial soap was unaffordable, and budgeting under extreme constraint meant every cent tracked and justified. The art of substitution reached new heights. Eggs could be replaced with extra baking powder and vinegar in some recipes. Butter could be replaced with lard or drippings. Milk could be stretched or replaced with water. Sugar could be reduced or replaced partially with molasses or corn syrup. The homemaker who understood why each ingredient functioned, what it actually contributed chemically and texturally to a dish, could make intelligent substitutions. The homemaker who only knew how to follow recipes was stranded. Canning reached volumes in the 1930s that the previous decade's refrigerators had begun to make seem unnecessary. The federal government promoted home canning aggressively through extension service programs. Pressure canners, which allowed safe canning of low-acid vegetables and meats, became essential equipment. The summer garden was now explicitly a survival strategy, and putting it up for winter was not an optional domestic art, but a practical necessity. Fun and creativity. The 1930s homemaker found creativity not in choosing between beautiful things, as her 1920s counterpart had, but in creating beautiful things from almost nothing. The flour sack quilt, pieced from the printed fabric of empty sacks, was as beautiful as any quilt made from purchased fabric, and carried an additional beauty of ingenuity and necessity that purchased fabric could not provide. Making something lovely from the materials of hardship was its own form of artistry. Depression glass. The colored pressed glass dishes that came free in boxes of oatmeal or could be purchased for pennies became the decade's collectible. A woman who assembled a full set of pink or green depression glass had created a table that was genuinely beautiful, at costs measured in pennies over years. The pleasure of a pretty table was not abandoned in hard times. It was achieved differently. The movies were the decade's great escape, and even during the Depression, many families managed the dime for a ticket on a Saturday afternoon. The glamour of Hollywood, the gowns, the penthouses, the apparently effortless lives, provided a form of relief that economists of happiness would understand, the temporary suspension of difficulty through immersion in possibility. 1000%. The homemaker who went to see a Busby Berkeley musical came home to her beans and her mending, but she came home having traveled somewhere else for 2 hours. Radio programs as shared entertainment gave the household comedy, drama, and the reassurance of other voices. Jack Benny and Amos and Andy in the soap operas. Community potlucks as shared food and social pleasure. Church socials and suppers providing free community entertainment. Card games at home for cheap evenings of company and laughter. And the Victory Garden, already a Depression staple before it became a wartime word, as creative project and source of genuine pride. Modern trends and innovations. Innovation in the 1930s had to justify itself economically in a way the carefree 1920s had not required. New products that saved money were adopted eagerly. New products that cost money without obvious payoff were viewed with suspicion. Kraft macaroni and cheese, introduced in 1937, sold 8 million boxes in its first year at 19 cents each. The appeal was obvious. A complete meal for a family of 4 for under a quarter, requiring only boiling water and butter, or the bacon grease that most Depression households saved in a can beside the stove. It was not the most nutritious meal available, but it was filling, children loved it, and it cost almost nothing. The 1930s homemaker added it to her repertoire without apology. Spam arrived in the same year, offering cheap shelf-stable protein from Hormel at a price that made it accessible even to struggling families. The canned meat product could be sliced and fried, added to casseroles, or eaten cold. It was not glamorous. It was practical, affordable, and calorie-dense in a decade when calories were sometimes scarce. It would go on to become a fixture of wartime cooking the following decade. The Federal Extension Service expansion was perhaps the decade's most important domestic innovation. Home economists reaching rural families carried practical knowledge about nutrition, food preservation, and budget management to households in genuine need. Cooperative canning centers provided community facilities for home preservation, and the electric washing machine continued its spread, even in hard times, because the savings in labor it represented had genuine economic value. Cost of living. The numbers of the Depression decade are stark in a way that requires no analysis. When average family income fell from $2,300 in 1929 to $1,500 in 1933, And when millions of families had no income at all, the arithmetic of feeding and clothing a family became genuinely desperate. In 1933, a loaf of bread cost 7 cents. A pound of dried beans was 5 cents. Eggs were 29 cents a dozen. Beef ran 22 cents a pound and pork 16 cents. A whole chicken cost 41 cents. Flour was 21 cents for 5 pounds, and cornmeal was 15 cents for the same. Lard was 9 cents a pound. 10 pounds of potatoes cost 20 cents. Cabbage was 3 cents a pound and onions 4 cents. Coffee was 27 cents a pound. 5 pounds of sugar cost 27 cents. The emergency weekly food budget for a family of 4 was $5. A box of Kraft macaroni and cheese when it arrived in 1937 was 19 cents. A movie ticket was 10 to 25 cents. The federal government's emergency food budgets, drawn up to establish minimum adequate nutrition standards, were the decade's baseline. The homemaker who could feed her family on $5 per week had achieved something. Many families were working with less. The recipes that circulated through women's clubs, church groups, and extension service programs were tested against these budgets, and the best of them, bean soup, cornbread, vegetable stew, braised tough cuts, were genuinely nutritious and economical. The garden was the Depression household's most important economic asset after the homemaker's skill itself. A productive kitchen garden could provide a family's vegetables for the summer and, through canning and root cellar storage, through a significant portion of the winter. The difference between a family with a good garden and a family without one could be the difference between adequate nutrition and genuine hunger. Community building and culture. The Depression returned community to its older, more serious purpose. The social pleasures of the 1920s, the bridge clubs organized for enjoyment, the women's literary societies meeting for intellectual stimulation, did not disappear, but they were supplemented by networks organized around need. The church became more important than ever as a distribution point for community assistance. Women's organizations shifted their programs toward practical aid. The community life of the 1930s was organized around survival. Church food pantries and charity meals provided organized community assistance. Community canning centers shared facilities for home preservation. Women's club relief programs collected and distributed necessities. Neighborhood food sharing created informal networks of mutual support. School lunch programs began to emerge with federal support, feeding children who came to school hungry. WPA and CCC family networks formed communities among federal workers and their families. Labor union auxiliaries supported working-class families. And Farm Bureau women's programs provided rural homemaker education and support. The cooperative spirit of Depression-era communities produced some lasting institutional changes. School lunch programs, originally improvised by teachers and parents feeding children who came to school hungry, became formalized with federal support. Community gardens in urban areas provided food for families without land. Neighborhood associations organized around practical needs. Sharing a pressure canner, pooling resources to buy in bulk, organizing childcare so women could work when work was available. The Extension Service home economists who traveled to rural communities in the 1930s were among the decade's unsung heroes. These women, most of them college-trained in home economics, carried practical knowledge about nutrition, food preservation, and budget management to families in genuine need. They demonstrated canning techniques, helped families plant more productive gardens, taught stretching recipes, and provided a connection to resources and information that isolated farm families might otherwise have lacked entirely. Family and relationships. The Depression's effect on family structure was profound and not always in the direction that hardship narratives suggest. While many families were stressed, separated by the necessity of men going where work could be found, or broken by the psychological damage of sustained unemployment, many others were drawn closer together by shared difficulty. The family that ate simple food together, gathered around the radio in the evening, and found pleasure in each other's company without spending money was in some ways more intensely a family than the prosperous one with its separate entertainments. The homemaker's role in maintaining family cohesion was direct and daily. Her ability to put food on the table, however plain, was a form of reassurance. The clean house, the mended clothing, the small domestic routines maintained against the chaos outside, these were signals to her children that normal life continued, that their parents were in control, that the family would be all right. Whether or not she fully believed it herself, she performed this confidence for her household. Multi-generational households increased as relatives moved in to share costs. Marriage rates declined as couples postponed weddings they couldn't afford. Birth rates reached historic lows as families limited children out of economic fear. Children contributed more, older children working, younger ones helping at home. Family entertainment happened at home. Radio, cards, reading aloud, front porch sitting. The garden became a family project with children assigned vegetable tending duties. Clothing was passed down and remade, nothing wasted, everything repurposed. And neighbors became extended family as community became a survival network. Seasonal and thematic homemaking. The seasonal rhythms of the Depression-era household were organized around a single overriding goal: getting enough food preserved, stored, and available to see the family through winter and into spring. Every season had its critical tasks, and missing them had real consequences. The homemaker who failed to put up enough tomatoes in August because the summer had been difficult would face an emptier pantry in February. Spring planting was planned with military precision and economic calculation. Every square foot of garden space was evaluated for yield and caloric value. Root vegetables, potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, were prioritized for their storage qualities. Beans, which could be dried and stored indefinitely, were planted generously. The flower garden shrank. The kitchen garden expanded. Seed saving from the previous year's harvest was essential. Buying seeds cost money that might not exist. High summer meant the peak canning season. Beans, tomatoes, corn, peaches, pickles, everything that could be put up was put up. The homemaker who worked through the heat of August with a pressure canner was doing the most important single work of her domestic year. The jars cooling on the counter were her family's winter insurance. Winter was the testing season. The homemaker who had preserved well in summer faced winter with relative confidence. The one who had been unable to garden or preserve, whether from lack of land, illness, or the particular bad luck of a failed crop, faced a lean winter that required help from neighbors, church, or charity. The shame attached to accepting such help was real and painful. Providing it quietly was a community art, homemaking, and personal growth. The personal growth of the 1930s homemaker was forged under conditions that leave little room for reflection. Surviving the Depression was not a project of self-improvement. It was a daily exercise in practical competence, emotional endurance, and the particular form of courage required to keep going when keeping going is hard. The homemaker who came through the decade intact had developed something that the more comfortable decades before and after could not produce: a deep and tested knowledge of what she was actually capable of. This knowledge was not always consciously claimed. The women who managed their households through the Depression often described their experience in modest terms, as simply doing what had to be done, as not having a choice, as being no different from everyone else in their community. But the organizational skill, the creative problem-solving, the emotional intelligence required to keep a family functioning through years of genuine hardship was remarkable, and the women who possessed it knew, on some level, that they possessed it. What the 1930s built in the homemaker included resourcefulness as a reflex, the ability to improvise without distress, nutritional intelligence, knowing how to feed a family well on almost nothing, the permanent habit of waste elimination, using everything completely, emotional regulation, maintaining household morale under sustained pressure, community generosity, giving when giving was costly, preservation mastery in all its forms, substitution skills that could make any recipe work with what was available, and a deep gratitude for sufficiency. An understanding of the real difference between enough and plenty that the comfortable decades would never fully teach. It happens. Even in the Depression, domestic mishaps continued. These stories have an edge of gallows humor. Laugh with her, not at her. The mock apple pie incident. Mock apple pie, made with Ritz crackers, lemon juice, and sugar instead of actual apples, was the decade's most surprising recipe success. One homemaker made it for her husband without mentioning the substitution. He ate 2 pieces and complimented her on the apples. She told him the truth. He did not believe her. She showed him the recipe. He reread it 3 times, took another bite, and said nothing for a long moment. "Well," he said finally, "I don't know whether to be impressed with you or suspicious of every apple pie I've ever eaten." She took this as a compliment. The sourdough starter disaster, sourdough bread, made with a fermented starter culture rather than purchased yeast, was economical and reliable. One homemaker maintained her starter for 2 years through the hardest part of the Depression, feeding it carefully, keeping it alive through summer heat and winter cold, and producing excellent bread twice a week. Her daughter, 7, was given the job of feeding the starter one morning while her mother was at the neighbor's. The daughter, applying her best housekeeping instincts, decided the jar was dirty and washed it thoroughly. The 2-year-old starter was gone. It took the household a week to stop mourning it. The flour sack situation. Flour companies printed their sacks in attractive patterns specifically because homemakers were sewing them into clothing. One homemaker bought her flour carefully, matching patterns to accumulate enough fabric for her daughter's dress. Over 6 months, she bought 12 sacks of gold medal flour in the same blue floral print. When she finally spread all 12 sacks on the table, she discovered that 2 of them, acquired from a different store, were a slightly different shade of blue. Her daughter wore the dress anyway. No one noticed. But she noticed. The Depression glass collection. Depression glass came free in cereal boxes and oatmeal packages, and one homemaker had assembled a near-complete set of pink glass over 3 years of careful shopping. One evening, her husband, reaching for a glass of water in the dark, knocked the entire shelf of accumulated pink glass onto the kitchen floor. The sound was spectacular. He stood in the kitchen doorway while she surveyed the damage and very carefully said nothing. She looked at the floor for a long time. Then she said, "Well, now I know what I'm shopping for." And she started over. Step into their shoes. It is a November morning in 1933. And she has $4.75 to feed her family of 5 for the next 2 weeks. She has written the number on a piece of paper and folded it into her apron pocket, where it has lived since her husband handed it to her on Friday. It is Tuesday now. She has looked at the number so often that she no longer needs to unfold the paper. She wakes before the children. She always does now, because the morning hour before they are up is the hour she does her best thinking. The kitchen is cold. She lights the stove with wood from the pile her son split last week, and while it warms, she writes her list. Not a shopping list, exactly. A calculation. What they have, what they need, what is possible. They have half a sack of flour, a quarter bushel of potatoes in the root cellar, dried beans. She counts the jars, 11 nearly full. 22 quarts of tomatoes she put up in August, 6 jars of apple butter, some cornmeal, a small amount of lard, salt and baking powder, and the last of the coffee. They do not have butter, sugar to speak of, eggs, the chickens have slowed for winter, or meat beyond the salt pork she is rationing carefully. With $4.75 she can buy more flour, more cornmeal, dried split peas for soup variety, some fatback to supplement the salt pork, a small bag of sugar, and possibly, if the prices are right at the market on Thursday, a few carrots and turnips to extend the root cellar stores. She will need to buy no vegetables beyond that. The garden has provided. The children come down at 7. She has made cornmeal mush. It takes 15 minutes and costs almost nothing, and there is apple butter to put on it, and coffee lightened with a little canned milk for herself and the 2 oldest. The youngest gets milk she traded for with the neighbor's eggs last week. This is a full breakfast. She presents it as such, and it is received as such, because she has learned that presentation is not pretense, but is itself a form of nourishment. After breakfast, the older children go to school. Her son, 12, has a job on Tuesdays and Thursdays sweeping out the hardware store for 15 cents. She does not think about what the 15 cents represents. that it is her child doing the work that should be her husband's, because thinking about it does not help. What helps is making sure he has a warm coat, which she has mended twice, and that he comes home to a hot supper. The morning is for the beans. She soaks a full pot. They'll provide dinner today and possibly tomorrow, and the cooking water itself is nutritious enough to drink. While they cook, she mends, because mending is the one task she can do while her hands are cold and her mind is elsewhere. She has her grandmother's thimble. She has her mother's needle case. Some things have survived everything. By noon, the beans are nearly done. She seasons them with the salt pork and a handful of dried herbs from the summer garden and a splash of the tomatoes. She makes cornbread from a recipe she has had so long it lives in her hands rather than her head. Flour, cornmeal, lard, baking powder, water. It is done in 20 minutes. The house smells like a house where people are cared for. In the afternoon, while the youngest naps, she works on the quilt. It is made from the family's worn-out clothing, a block from her husband's ruined work shirt, a block from the children's outgrown summer dresses, a block from her own apron that tore beyond mending. It will be warm. It is also, in its way, beautiful, a record of the family's life in fabric. She works on it in the afternoon light and does not think about the $4.75, and for an hour she is only making something beautiful. Her week, November 1933, Monday. Bean soup started, cornbread, children to school. Tuesday, son's hardware job, 15 cents earned. Beans continue, mending. Wednesday, market day, careful shopping against the budget. Thursday, potato and turnip soup, son's second hardware day. Friday, husband's pay if work held, plan next week. Saturday, baking day, bread, cornbread, whatever treats the pantry allows. Sunday, best meal of the week, church, neighbors for afternoon coffee. Running total, food expenditure tracked against the $4.75 budget. Recipes from the 1930s. These recipes are economical by necessity and excellent by skill. Read them with respect for what they represent. These recipes come from the Depression kitchen at its most inventive, making genuine nourishment from the most economical ingredients, finding pleasure in food that cost almost nothing, and demonstrating that constraint can be its own kind of creativity. Depression bean soup. This is the decade's most important recipe. Dried beans, a ham hock or salt pork, and whatever vegetables the root cellar offered. This soup fed millions of American families through the worst years of the Depression. It is nutritionally excellent, deeply satisfying, and costs almost nothing. Ingredients: 1 pound of dried navy or Great Northern beans, soaked overnight. 1 ham hock or half a pound of salt pork or fatback. 1 large onion diced. 3 stalks of celery diced. 2 carrots diced. 3 cloves of garlic. 1 can of tomatoes or 2 fresh tomatoes chopped. Salt, pepper, and dried thyme. Water to cover about 8 cups. Directions: soak the beans overnight and drain and rinse them. Place beans, ham hock, and 8 cups of water in a large pot. Bring to a boil, skim the foam, and reduce to a low simmer. After 1 hour, add the onion, celery, carrots, and garlic. Simmer for 1 to 2 more hours until the beans are completely tender. Remove the ham hock, strip the meat, and return it to the pot. Add tomatoes and seasoning and simmer 20 minutes more. Serve with cornbread. Leftovers improve the next day. Mock apple pie, the Ritz cracker pie. This is perhaps the Depression era's most famous recipe, a pie made with no apples whatsoever, using Ritz crackers dissolved in spiced syrup to approximate the flavor and texture of apple filling. Remarkably, it works. Nabisco printed the recipe on Ritz cracker boxes from 1934 onward, and millions of families made it throughout the Depression and World War II years. Ingredients: pastry for a double-crust 9-inch pie, 36 Ritz crackers, coarsely broken, 1 3/4 cups of water, 2 cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, 2 tablespoons of fresh lemon juice, the zest of 1 lemon, 2 tablespoons of butter, half a teaspoon of cinnamon. Directions: preheat the oven to 425 degrees and line a pie plate with the bottom crust. Place the broken crackers evenly in the crust. In a saucepan, combine water, sugar, and cream of tartar, bring to a boil, and boil for 15 minutes. Add the lemon juice and zest, and pour the hot syrup over the crackers. Dot with butter and sprinkle with cinnamon. Cover with the top crust, crimp and cut steam vents. Bake 30 to 35 minutes until golden. Cool before cutting. Serve warm. Do not tell your guests what is in it until after they have complimented you. Wacky cake. No eggs, no milk, no butter. This remarkable cake spread through Depression-era communities because it solved the problem of baking without eggs, milk, or butter, the three ingredients most likely to be absent from a struggling pantry. Mixed right in the baking pan, it is still moist, chocolatey, and excellent. The chemistry is real. Vinegar and baking soda create the lift that eggs would otherwise provide. Ingredients: 1.5 cups of all-purpose flour, 1 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of unsweetened cocoa powder, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, half a teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, 1 tablespoon of white vinegar, 6 tablespoons of vegetable oil or melted lard, 1 cup of cold water. Directions: preheat the oven to 350 degrees. In an ungreased 9x9 baking pan, combine flour, sugar, cocoa, baking soda, and salt. Make 3 wells in the dry ingredients. Pour vanilla in one, vinegar in another, and oil in the third. Pour cold water over everything and stir until just combined. Do not overmix. Bake 30 to 35 minutes until a toothpick comes out clean. Cool in the pan. Dust with powdered sugar if you have it, or serve plain. This cake keeps well and improves slightly on the second day. What we learned, and what we still use today. The 1930s homemaker asks more of us than admiration. She asks us to understand what genuine resourcefulness looks like when the stakes are real, not aesthetic, not philosophical, but actual. Her children's health, her family's survival, depended on her ability to make something from almost nothing, day after day, without a safety net or a guarantee. We are not in that situation, but we can learn from her about thrift as a practice rather than a deprivation, about the dignity and intelligence required to manage a household well under constraint, about the difference between wanting things and needing them. Her generation produced the most financially disciplined adults in American history. They saved, they avoided debt, they maintained emergency reserves. They did these things because they knew in their bodies what the alternative felt like. Keep a full pantry. The Depression homemaker who had a full root cellar in October slept better in February. Your emergency pantry is peace of mind. Know your substitutions. Eggs can be replaced. Butter can be replaced. The cook who understands why each ingredient works can work without it. Learn to make bean soup from scratch. It is the most nutritious, filling, and economical meal in the history of cooking. It is also excellent. Waste nothing. The fat from cooking is flavor for the next dish. The vegetable scraps are tomorrow's stock. Nothing is garbage until you have extracted everything from it. The garden is an investment, not a hobby. Every tomato you grow is one you don't buy. This was survival arithmetic in the 1930s. It is still good arithmetic. Make something beautiful from what you have. The flower sack quilt was as beautiful as any other quilt. Constraint does not preclude artistry. Community is practical, not optional. The neighbors who shared their surplus and their skills were the decade's real safety net. Be that neighbor. She stood in her kitchen in November 1933 with $4.75 and fed her family. She did not do this because she had no other choice. She did it because her skill, her knowledge, and her absolute refusal to accept failure as an option made it possible. That is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. And some of what she knew is still worth knowing.